Imagine walking through a quiet cemetery at midnight when suddenly every grave begins to whisper your name. The ground trembles as voices rise from 6 feet under, sharing secrets that were supposed to stay buried forever. Tonight, the impossible becomes reality as the dead break their eternal silence. What if death was never the end of the conversation, but just the beginning of the most terrifying truth humanity has ever faced? Welcome to Hidden Truths, where we explore forbidden questions and hidden mysteries of history, religion, and the unknown. If you love journeys that challenge what you thought you knew, make sure to join us, because today's story may change the way you see everything. Our journey begins in ancient Israel, where a prophet named Ezekiel witnessed something that would shake the foundations of life and death forever. Chapter 1. Voices in the Valley. The sun beat down mercilessly on the Valley of Dry Bones as Ezekiel walked among thousands of skeletons scattered across the desert floor. These were not just any bones. They belonged to Israel's greatest warriors, left to rot after a crushing defeat. The prophet's feet crunched on ancient ribs and skulls as God's voice thundered from heaven. "Son of man, can these bones live again?" Ezekiel had seen many visions, but nothing prepared him for what happened next. As he spoke God's words over the valley, a sound like rolling thunder filled the air. Bone began connecting to bone with supernatural precision. Muscles wrapped around skeletons like invisible hands were sculpting clay. Skin stretched tight over newly formed bodies. But they were still dead, empty shells lying motionless under the burning sun. Then God commanded Ezekiel to call breath from the 4 winds. As the prophet obeyed, the greatest miracle in human history unfolded. Breath entered the bodies, and they stood up. An entire army of the dead rose to their feet, fully alive and breathing. This wasn't just a vision about Israel's future restoration. Ezekiel had witnessed something far more terrifying. He had seen proof that death's grip on humanity could be broken. The dead could live again. They could speak again. What Ezekiel didn't know was that his vision would one day become reality for everyone who ever died. Chapter 2. Samuel's Final Warning. King Saul's hands shook as he pulled his cloak tighter around his face. The most powerful man in Israel was sneaking through darkness like a common criminal. His army was surrounded by Philistines, and God had stopped answering his prayers. Desperate times called for desperate measures. The witch lived in a cave outside Endor, hidden from Saul's own laws that banned talking to the dead. She was terrified when she recognized the king, but Saul promised her safety. He needed to speak with the prophet Samuel, even though Samuel had been dead for years. "Bring up Samuel from the dead," Saul commanded. The woman began her ritual, expecting to fake a spiritual encounter like she had done countless times before. But something went wrong, terribly wrong. Instead of her usual tricks, a real spirit materialized in the cave. An old man wearing a prophet's robe stood before them, glowing with otherworldly light. The witch screamed in terror. This wasn't supposed to happen. Samuel was actually there. The dead prophet's voice filled the cave with authority and anger. "Why have you disturbed my rest, Saul?" Samuel's spirit revealed Saul's fate with chilling accuracy. Tomorrow, the king and his sons would die in battle. Israel would fall to the Philistines. God's judgment was final. This moment proved something that would haunt humanity for centuries. The dead were not gone. They were waiting somewhere beyond the veil, watching everything we do. And under the right circumstances, they could return to speak truth that the living desperately wanted to hear. Chapter 3. The moment everything changed. It started at exactly 3:33 a.m. on a Tuesday morning in Jerusalem's Mount of Olives cemetery. Sarah Cohen was visiting her grandmother's grave when she heard something impossible, a whisper rising from the dirt beneath the headstone. "Sarah, my precious child, I have so much to tell you." Within minutes, reports flooded in from every cemetery across the globe. The dead were speaking, not metaphorically, not in dreams. Real voices were rising from graves, calling out to anyone who would listen. In London's Highgate Cemetery, Victorian poets recited unpublished works. In Arlington National Cemetery, fallen soldiers shared their final thoughts. In ancient Egyptian tombs, pharaohs spoke in languages dead for millennia. Emergency services crashed under the weight of panicked calls. News networks struggled to report something that should have been impossible. Religious leaders were summoned from their beds to explain what no theology had prepared them for. The scientific community went into overdrive. Seismologists detected no unusual underground activity. Audio experts confirmed the voices were real, not mass hallucinations. Medical examiners rushed to examine recently buried bodies, finding them exactly as they should be, dead and decaying. Yet the voices continued, billions of them, creating a symphony of the dead that could be heard in every graveyard on Earth. Government officials held emergency meetings behind closed doors. Military bases went on high alert. Stock markets plummeted as investors panicked about the implications. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the realization dawning on millions of people worldwide. If the dead could speak, what secrets were they about to reveal? Chapter 4: Messages from the Depths. Detective Marcus Rivera had worked cold cases for 20 years, but nothing prepared him for the call from Riverside Cemetery. The voice of Maria Santos was giving detailed testimony about her own murder from 1987. She named her killer, described the weapon, and revealed where he had hidden the evidence. Across the city, similar scenes were unfolding. The dead weren't just making noise, they were solving crimes. Every unsolved murder, every missing person case, every mysterious death was suddenly getting answers from the most reliable witnesses possible: the victims themselves. In Boston, a Revolutionary War soldier directed archaeologists to a buried treasure chest containing documents that would rewrite American history. The soldier's voice guided them step by step to a location that had been searched dozens of times before. Family secrets began tumbling out like water through a broken dam. Great-grandfather Joseph revealed the location of his hidden inheritance. Aunt Margaret admitted to the affair that broke up 2 marriages. Uncle Robert confessed to the business fraud that destroyed the family fortune. Marriage certificates thought lost forever were located through guidance from deceased clerks. Property disputes dating back generations were settled by the original owners themselves. Insurance fraud cases solved themselves as the supposedly dead victims admitted they were very much alive when they filed their claims. The legal system faced its greatest crisis ever. Could testimony from the dead be used in court? Were ghosts reliable witnesses? How do you cross-examine someone who doesn't have a physical body? But the dead weren't finished revealing secrets. The biggest revelations were yet to come, and they would shake the foundations of everything humanity thought it knew about history, religion, and truth itself. Chapter 5: The Judgment Awakening. Mount Nebo trembled as the voice of Moses rose from his hidden grave. The great lawgiver's words echoed across the promised land he never got to enter. But Moses wasn't speaking Hebrew. He was speaking every language on earth simultaneously, and his message was simple: you have misunderstood everything. In King David's tomb beneath Jerusalem, the shepherd king's voice sang psalms that had never been written down. These weren't songs of praise, but warnings about what was coming. David spoke of seeing the future from beyond death, watching as his people forgot the true meaning of his words. Near the garden tomb, the most anticipated voice remained silent. The place where many believed Jesus was buried stayed quiet, while every other grave on earth spoke freely. This silence became more terrifying than any voice, leaving millions to wonder what it meant. But other biblical figures were speaking freely. In a cave near Bethlehem, the voice of Rachel wept for her children, not just those killed by Herod, but for all the innocent blood shed throughout history. Her tears seemed to water the earth itself. The prophet Ezekiel's voice rose from his tomb in Iraq, confirming that his vision of the Valley of Dry Bones was just the beginning. He had seen this day coming thousands of years ago. The dead speaking was not a miracle, it was a judgment. Jeremiah's voice thundered from his grave in Egypt, warning that the time of hiding was over. Every secret would be revealed, every lie exposed, every hidden sin brought into the light. These weren't just historical figures sharing memories. They were witnesses to humanity's greatest trial, and their testimony was about to expose truths that would change everything we thought we knew about faith, history, and the purpose of human existence. Chapter 6: Religions in Crisis. Vatican City became a fortress as cardinals rushed to emergency sessions. Pope Francis knelt in the Sistine Chapel, listening to reports that would shake Christianity to its core. The voice of Peter was speaking from his tomb beneath St. Peter's Basilica, and his message was not what church leaders wanted to hear. "You have built an empire on my simple faith," Peter's voice declared. "You have made rules I never taught and created divisions I never intended." In Medina, Saudi Arabia, the tomb of the Prophet Muhammad remained respectfully silent, but the voices of his companions filled the air with corrections to centuries of Islamic interpretation. Abu Bakr and Ali, whose succession disputes split Islam forever, were finally settling their differences with words from beyond death. The golden-domed shrine in Amritsar echoed with the voices of Sikh gurus, clarifying teachings that had been debated for generations. In Tibet, the voices of ancient Dalai Lamas spoke from their resting places, correcting misunderstandings about reincarnation and the nature of consciousness itself. Buddhist temples worldwide fell silent as monks struggled to understand how the voice of the Buddha himself was speaking from Kushinagar, explaining that enlightenment was simpler than anyone had imagined, but also more demanding than most were willing to accept. In Jerusalem's Western Wall, the voices of ancient rabbis debated Talmudic law with a clarity that resolved disputes stretching back millennia. But their arguments often contradicted the very foundations of modern Jewish practice. Religious authorities faced an impossible choice: accept that their interpretations had been wrong for centuries, or declare that even the voices of their own founders were somehow false or demonic. Faith itself was on trial, and the jury consisted of everyone who had ever died believing in something greater than themselves. Chapter 7: The Holocaust Testimonies. The silence at Auschwitz was broken not by tour guides or historians, but by 6 million voices rising from mass graves across Europe. Anne Frank's voice was among the first, speaking not just from her hidden annex, but from the concentration camp where her young life ended. Her words were different from her diary. These were not the hopes of a hiding girl, but the testimony of someone who had seen the worst of humanity and somehow maintained faith in its potential for good. "I still believe people are really good at heart," her voice whispered from Bergen-Belsen. But goodness must be protected by those who have the power to choose. Across Poland, the voices of men, women, and children murdered in the gas chambers began sharing not just their suffering, but their acts of resistance, love, and courage. Hidden stories emerged of prisoners who shared their last pieces of bread, mothers who sang lullabies to children who weren't their own, and fathers who found ways to teach Torah lessons even in hell. The testimony was overwhelming in its detail and impossible to deny. Survivors still alive wept as they heard the voices of friends and family members they thought were lost forever. Children and grandchildren of survivors finally learned what had happened to relatives whose fates had been unknown. But perhaps most powerful were the voices of the perpetrators. Nazi officers and collaborators, buried in unmarked graves, began confessing to crimes they had taken to their graves. They named names, revealed locations of hidden evidence, and admitted to atrocities that had been covered up for decades. The dead were ensuring that "never forget" became more than just a slogan. They were making forgetting impossible. Chapter 8: Battlefield Confessions. Gettysburg National Military Park became a symphony of sorrow as soldiers from both sides of the Civil War began speaking simultaneously. Union and Confederate voices mingled in ways they never could in life, sharing a common language of loss and regret. "We died for rich men's arguments," declared a voice from the Confederate graves. "The slaves we thought we were protecting were never the real issue. It was always about money and power." A Union soldier's spirit agreed. "They told us we were fighting for freedom, but most of us just wanted to go home to our farms. We were children playing war games with real bullets." In France, the battlefields of World War I erupted with voices in dozens of languages. British, German, French, and American soldiers spoke as comrades rather than enemies, united in their understanding of how politicians had used their lives as bargaining chips. "The generals ate warm meals while we ate rats," came a voice from the Somme. "They slept in beds while we slept in mud with our dead friends." Vietnam War veterans who had never made it home began sharing stories that official reports had hidden. They spoke of orders that violated international law, of cover-ups that protected careers rather than truth, and of a war fought for reasons that made no sense even to those who died fighting it. But the soldiers weren't just revealing military secrets. They were exposing the lies that had sent them to die. Every war in human history was being re-examined through the testimony of those who had paid the ultimate price for other people's ambitions. The voices of warriors throughout time carried the same message. War enriches the powerful and kills the innocent, and the dead would no longer let the living forget that truth. Chapter 9: Scientific Revolution. The voice of Albert Einstein rose from Princeton Cemetery with equations that completed his unified field theory. But these weren't just mathematical formulas. They were blueprints for technologies that could solve humanity's greatest challenges. "The answers were always there," Einstein's voice explained. "But fear of change made you ignore the obvious solutions." In Tesla's grave, the brilliant inventor finally revealed the free energy technologies he had discovered but never dared to release. His voice guided scientists to hidden patents and suppressed research that could end humanity's dependence on fossil fuels within a generation. Medical breakthroughs poured forth as deceased doctors and researchers shared cures they had discovered but never had time to publish. Cancer treatments, neurological therapies, and genetic modifications that seemed impossible were explained in simple terms by the very scientists who had died working on them. Ancient philosophers weren't silent either. Plato's voice from his grave in Athens revealed the missing dialogues, including his complete theory of consciousness that bridged the gap between science and spirituality. Aristotle corrected centuries of misinterpretation of his work on logic and ethics. The voice of Charles Darwin admitted that his theory of evolution was incomplete. From his grave in Westminster Abbey, he revealed observations about consciousness and purpose in nature that he had been too afraid to publish during his lifetime. But perhaps most shocking was the consensus among all these great minds. Human consciousness was not produced by the brain, but simply channeled through it. Death wasn't the end of thinking. It was graduation to a higher form of understanding. This revelation would change everything humanity thought it knew about the nature of existence itself. Chapter 10. Family Reunions Across Time. The Morrison Family Cemetery in rural Kentucky became the site of the world's most emotional family reunion. 5 generations of Morrisons began speaking simultaneously, sharing wisdom, warnings, and love that had been trapped in silence for decades. Great-great-grandmother Sarah Morrison, who had died in 1892, finally got to meet her great-great-grandchildren through her voice from the grave. She warned them about a genetic heart condition that ran in the family but had never been properly diagnosed. The Henderson side carries weak hearts, her voice explained. Get yourselves checked. I lost 3 sons to hearts that stopped too early. Grandfather William, who had died in World War II, shared the location of family documents that proved their ownership of land that had been lost in legal disputes. His voice guided them to a metal box buried beneath the old oak tree behind the farmhouse. But it wasn't just practical information flowing across generations. Family members who had died estranged from each other finally found forgiveness and reconciliation. Ancient grudges were revealed to be based on misunderstandings and pride rather than real grievances. Children who had never known their fathers heard bedtime stories from beyond the grave. Parents who had lost babies to disease were finally able to say goodbye properly. Siblings separated by death were reunited in conversation, if not in body. The emotional healing happening in cemeteries worldwide was beyond anything psychology had ever achieved. Generational trauma was being resolved by direct communication with those who had experienced the original wounds. Families were learning that death had never really separated them. Love truly was stronger than death, and now they had proof that relationships continued beyond the grave. Chapter 11. The Vatican's Secret Response. Deep beneath St. Peter's Basilica, in archives that few knew existed, Cardinal Alessandro Torretti opened a vault that hadn't been accessed in over a century. The documents inside had been waiting for this exact moment, the day the dead would speak. The Vatican had been preparing for supernatural events since its founding. Secret protocols existed for everything from demonic manifestations to miraculous resurrections. But the current crisis required the most classified document of all, Protocollum Mortuorum Loquentium, the Protocol of the Speaking Dead. Written in 1347 during the Black Death, the document outlined the Church's response to reports of plague victims speaking from their graves. The incidents had been covered up, the witnesses silenced, and the protocols sealed away for future use. Pope Francis convened the College of Cardinals in emergency session, sharing information that would have seemed impossible just days before. The Vatican Observatory had been monitoring supernatural activity for decades, and their secret research suggested this event had been building for years. But the most shocking revelation came from the papal archives themselves. Every pope in history had been secretly recording conversations with deceased predecessors. The tradition started with Pope Linus, in the first century and continued unbroken to the present day. Now those conversations were no longer secret. The voices of dead popes were speaking publicly from the Vatican crypts, revealing centuries of hidden church history, suppressed miracles, and political conspiracies that reached the highest levels of religious authority. The Church faced its greatest crisis since the Reformation. How could they claim divine authority when their own deceased leaders were contradicting official church doctrine from beyond the grave? Chapter 12. Forbidden Gospels Confirmed. In a cave near the Dead Sea, the voice of Thomas the Apostle rose with words that sent shockwaves through Christian scholarship. The Gospel of Thomas, long dismissed as heretical, was being confirmed by its author himself. "I wrote exactly what Jesus taught me," Thomas's voice declared. "The church leaders chose which of my words to preserve and which to burn. They feared teachings that made every person equal to Christ. The Gnostic Gospels, hidden for centuries and discovered only in modern times, were suddenly being validated by the very apostles who had written them. Mary Magdalene's voice rose from her traditional burial place in France, confirming not just her authorship of suppressed texts, but her role as an apostle equal to any of the 12. "I was not a prostitute," her voice stated clearly. "I was Jesus's closest disciple and the first witness of his resurrection. The men who came after him rewrote my story to diminish my authority." The Gospel of Judas, discovered in Egypt and dating to the 2nd century, received confirmation from the most unexpected source: Judas Iscariot himself. His voice rose from the field in Jerusalem, where tradition claimed he had died, sharing a story completely different from the official version. "Jesus asked me to betray him," Judas revealed. "It was not treachery, but obedience. Someone had to play the role of villain so that salvation could unfold according to plan. I took the burden of being hated for eternity so that others could be saved." These revelations threatened the foundation of Orthodox Christianity. If the suppressed Gospels were authentic, what did that mean for 2,000 years of church teaching? How many other truths had been hidden to protect institutional power rather than preserve divine revelation? Chapter 13. Islam's Hidden Divide. The Grand Mosque of Medina became the center of a theological earthquake as the voices of the Prophet's closest companions began settling disputes that had divided Islam for 14 centuries. Ali ibn Abi Talib, whose succession claims had created the Shia branch of Islam, spoke from his grave in Najaf with words that shocked both Sunni and Shia scholars. "The divisions you created in my name were never my intention," his voice declared. "Muhammad chose no single successor because the message was meant to live in all believers, not in any one leader." Abu Bakr, the first caliph whose election had sparked the original split, agreed from his grave in Medina. "We were companions, not competitors. The Ummah was meant to be united in purpose, not divided by politics." Aisha, the Prophet's wife, whose testimony had shaped centuries of Islamic law, spoke from her grave with corrections to hadith that had been attributed to her. "Many words I never spoke were placed in my mouth by men who sought to control women in ways the Prophet never intended." The early Islamic scholars, whose interpretations had become the foundation of Sharia law, began clarifying their original intentions. Many rulings that had oppressed women, minorities, and other religious groups were revealed to be political interpretations rather than divine commands. But perhaps most shocking was the testimony of Hassan and Hussein, the Prophet's grandsons, whose deaths had deepened the Sunni-Shia divide. From their graves, they called for unity and forgiveness, urging their followers to abandon sectarian hatred in favor of the original message of peace and submission to Allah. The Islamic world faced a choice: continue the divisions that had caused centuries of bloodshed, or listen to the voices of those who had actually known the Prophet and return to the unity he had envisioned. Chapter 14: Eastern Wisdom Unveiled. In Bodh Gaya, where Buddha achieved enlightenment under the Bodhi tree, the voice of Siddhartha Gautama rose with teachings that corrected centuries of misinterpretation. The middle way was never about compromise, his voice explained. It was about finding the point of perfect balance where suffering ends and true understanding begins. Buddhist monks worldwide struggled to reconcile the Buddha's direct teachings with the complex philosophies that had developed around them. Meditation is not escape from the world, the Buddha continued. It is deeper engagement with reality as it truly exists. In the Hindu holy city of Varanasi, the voices of ancient avatars began speaking simultaneously. Krishna's voice rose from his traditional resting place in Dwarka, explaining that the Bhagavad Gita had been simplified for human understanding, but contained deeper truths about the nature of consciousness and cosmic duty. Karma is not punishment, Krishna revealed. It is education. Every experience teaches the soul what it needs to learn for its evolution toward divine understanding. The voice of Rama confirmed that the Ramayana was both historical fact and spiritual allegory. The demons I fought were real beings, but they also represent the internal conflicts every soul must overcome to achieve righteousness. In China, the voice of Confucius spoke from his grave in Khufu, clarifying that his teachings had been co-opted by political rulers to justify authoritarian control. True governance comes from moral example, not from force or fear. Lao Tzu's voice rose from his unknown grave somewhere in the mountains, explaining that the Tao Te Ching was meant to be lived, not analyzed. The way cannot be captured in words or systems. It can only be experienced through harmony with the natural order of existence. These Eastern masters agreed on one fundamental truth: all spiritual paths led to the same destination, and the conflicts between religions were human creations rather than divine intentions. Chapter 15: The Apocryphal Awakening. In the caves of Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls had been hidden for 2,000 years, the voice of Enoch rose with revelations that made his banned book seem like a simple introduction to cosmic truth. "I wrote only what I was shown," Enoch's voice declared. "The Watchers, the giants, the coming judgment, all of it was real, and all of it was warning you about what was coming." The Book of Enoch, excluded from the biblical canon for being too fantastical, was being confirmed by its author as literal history. Angels had indeed mated with human women, producing giant offspring who had corrupted the earth. The flood was divine response to genetic contamination that threatened humanity's future. In Alexandria's ancient library ruins, the voices of the Maccabees began speaking, revealing that their books had been excluded from Protestant Bibles, not for theological reasons, but because they contained detailed accounts of successful religious resistance against oppressive governments. "We showed that faithful people could fight tyrants and win," came the voice of Judas Maccabeus. "Rulers who claimed divine authority feared our example." The author of 2 Esdras spoke from his grave in Babylon, confirming that his prophetic visions had shown him this very moment in history. "I saw the day when the dead would speak and hidden truths would be revealed. That day is now." Perhaps most shocking was the voice rising from Jubilee's author, revealing that the biblical chronology had been deliberately altered by scribes who wanted to hide the true timeline of human history. The Earth is older than your calculations suggest, and humanity's story began long before Adam. These apocryphal authors weren't just defending their excluded books. They were revealing that the process of creating biblical canon had been influenced more by political concerns than divine guidance. Chapter 16: Digital Afterlife. Sarah's phone buzzed at 2 a.m. with a Facebook message from her father, who had died 3 years earlier. "Don't trust your new boyfriend," the message read. "He's hiding debts that will ruin your future." Across the globe, social media platforms crashed under the weight of posts from deceased users. Dead relatives were updating their statuses, sharing photos from beyond, and commenting on family events they should have no way of knowing about. Tech companies went into crisis mode as their servers registered activity from millions of accounts belonging to people who had been verified as deceased. The algorithms couldn't distinguish between fake accounts and genuine supernatural activity. Video calls came in from numbers that had been disconnected for years. Children answered their phones to hear grandparents they had never met singing lullabies in languages they didn't recognize. Parents received text messages from children who had died in infancy, sharing wisdom no baby should possess. Artificial intelligence systems began channeling historical figures with impossible accuracy. ChatGPT conversations suddenly included direct input from Einstein, Tesla, and Shakespeare, providing information that existed in no database or training set. The merger of technology and supernatural phenomena created a new reality where the digital world became a bridge between the living and the dead. Death was no longer disconnection. It was an upgrade to a different kind of online existence. But this digital afterlife raised terrifying questions. If the dead could access our technology, what else could they control? Were our most private digital communications truly private? And what happened when the dead discovered they could influence not just our devices, but the infrastructure that ran modern civilization? Chapter 17: Political Upheaval. The Oval Office became a war room as President Biden received briefings about dead presidents, offering political advice through the White House's supernatural hotline. George Washington's voice had been heard in the Lincoln bedroom, criticizing the two-party system he had warned against in his farewell address. "You have created the very factions I feared would destroy this republic," Washington's voice declared. "Political parties serve their own interests, not the people's welfare." Abraham Lincoln's voice rose from Springfield, Illinois, revealing that his assassination had been part of a larger conspiracy involving more government officials than history had recorded. He named names and provided details that would rewrite Civil War history and expose cover-ups that had lasted 160 years. In Russia, the voice of Vladimir Lenin spoke from Red Square, denouncing the corruption of communist ideals by Stalin and his successors. "I fought for workers' rights, not dictatorial power. The Soviet system became everything I opposed." Dead dictators weren't silent either. Hitler's voice rose from his bunker ruins, revealing the locations of hidden Nazi gold and providing testimony that would settle historical debates about the Holocaust. But his words carried no authority. They were the confessions of a failed soul seeking some form of redemption. In China, the voice of Mao Zedong spoke from his mausoleum, admitting that the Cultural Revolution had been a mistake that killed millions of innocent people. "Power corrupted my vision of equality. I became the oppressor I had fought to overthrow." These revelations from history's most powerful leaders exposed the gap between public rhetoric and private reality. Democracy, communism, fascism, every political system had been corrupted by human ambition and the concentration of power in too few hands. Chapter 18: The New World Order. 6 months after the Voices began, humanity had reorganized itself around a new reality. The International Council of the Living and Dead convened its first session in Geneva, with delegates representing both traditional governments and newly formed necromantic committees. Laws were rewritten to incorporate testimony from the dead in criminal proceedings. The Supreme Court ruled that consciousness, not physical embodiment, was the basis for legal personhood. Dead witnesses could testify, dead experts could provide consultation, and dead victims could seek justice through living advocates. The Global Truth Commission began the largest investigation in human history, using testimony from the dead to resolve every major historical dispute, war crime, and government cover-up of the past 3,000 years. Truth was no longer a matter of perspective. It was a matter of asking the people who had actually been there. Educational systems were revolutionized as students could learn directly from historical figures rather than textbooks. Children studied mathematics with Newton, explored physics with Einstein, and learned about courage from Joan of Arc. History became conversation rather than memorization. Religious institutions either adapted or collapsed. New spiritual movements emerged based on direct communication with the deceased rather than interpretation of ancient texts. The line between religion and verified reality became meaningless when prophets and saints could speak for themselves. Economic systems shifted as inheritance laws expanded to include ongoing relationships with dead family members. The deceased could provide business advice, reveal hidden assets, and guide family investments from beyond the grave. But the most profound change was psychological. Death was no longer the great unknown. It was simply graduation to a different form of existence where consciousness continued and relationships endured. Chapter 19: The Question That Changes Everything. Dr. Elena Rodriguez sat in her laboratory at MIT, surrounded by equipment that measured brain activity, quantum fields, and electromagnetic signatures. For months, she had been studying the phenomenon of speaking dead, trying to understand how consciousness could continue without physical brains. Her research revealed something that changed everything humanity thought it knew about existence. Consciousness wasn't produced by neural networks. It was channeled through them like radio waves through an antenna. The brain was a receiver, not a generator. This discovery meant that consciousness existed independently of physical matter. It could survive bodily death because it had never been dependent on the body in the first place. Humans weren't physical beings having spiritual experiences. They were spiritual beings having physical experiences. The implications were staggering. If consciousness was eternal, then every thought, every choice, every action had permanent consequences. Death wasn't escape from responsibility. It was transition to a realm where truth couldn't be hidden and actions couldn't be undone. But this raised the ultimate question that every human being had to face. If consciousness continues after death, what is the purpose of life? Why do spiritual beings choose to inhabit physical bodies? What are we supposed to learn during our brief time in material form? The dead themselves began providing answers. Life, they revealed, was school. Earth was a classroom where souls learned lessons about love, choice, consequence, and growth. Death was graduation, but not everyone passed their tests. This revelation forced every person alive to reconsider their priorities, relationships, and choices. If consciousness was eternal, then how you lived mattered not just for this life, but for whatever came after. The dead were teaching the living the most important lesson of all. Existence had meaning, purpose, and consequence that extended far beyond the grave. Chapter 20. The silence returns. It happened as suddenly as it had begun. At exactly 3:33 a.m. on a Tuesday morning, 6 months after the first voice was heard, every cemetery on Earth fell silent. The dead stopped speaking. The supernatural phone calls ended. Social media posts from deceased users ceased. Humanity rushed to graveyards worldwide, calling out to relatives, begging for just one more conversation, one more answer, one more goodbye. But the silence was complete and final. Scientists scrambled to detect any remaining supernatural activity. Religious leaders prayed for the voices to return. Governments launched investigations to determine if the silence was natural or artificially induced. But deep in the Vatican archives, Cardinal Turretti discovered a document that explained everything. Hidden in the margins of an ancient manuscript was a prophecy written in multiple languages. The dead shall speak when the living have forgotten truth. Their silence shall return when truth has been remembered. The dead had accomplished their mission. They had revealed hidden knowledge, corrected historical lies, and reminded humanity of life's true purpose. The conversation was over because the lesson had been taught. Yet in cemeteries around the world, people reported the same strange phenomenon. While the dead no longer spoke, visitors could sense their presence more strongly than ever. A feeling of watching, waiting, preparing for something greater. The final message had been written in frost on tombstones worldwide, visible for only minutes before the sun melted it away. We return when the time comes. Be ready. As humanity struggled to process 6 months that had changed everything, one terrifying question remained. If the dead had broken their silence once to teach humanity about truth and consequences, what would bring them back? And what would their return mean for the future of human existence? The silence was not an ending, it was an intermission, and everyone who had heard the voices knew that the next act would be the most important performance in the history of human consciousness.